All right, and then I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to try to monitor the chat as I go too, but if I kind of miss you, just please unmute and ask me to stop. I'm pretty informal and laid back when I present, so just feel free to, if you have big questions, ask those. All right. So when we talk about grading, right, we know certain grading practices are equitable and we know certain grading practices are not. And there's a lot of conversation in our district right now about equity in all things, equity within instruction, equitable access to resources. So there's this continuous push for equity. And so when we look at our grading practices, we want to make sure that those align with this ideal of equity that we are striving for within our district. If you look at our framework for teaching and learning, I could put dots all over this framework really when we talk through the lens of standards-based grading, but grades are a form of data, right? And it's a form of data that influences a lot of decisions that we make about students. And so we really want our grading system to promote a growth mindset within our students, and we want them to have multiple opportunities at mastery. We also want a grading system in which we get data, we get grades that are a true reflection of student mastery, so that we can make instructional decisions to help support and scaffold our students. And so I do this at the beginning of any grading conversation I hold, whether it's K2, 3, 5, whoever I'm talking to, just the acknowledgement that no grading system is perfect. Each grading system inherently has its pros and its cons. And so while I love standards-based grading, I did it with my middle school students, I'll acknowledge that no grading system is perfect. When you assign a grade to a student, inherently that's a judgment, and there are pros and cons. In a perfect world, we would give students feedback, and that's really all they need to learn and to grow, is that feedback. But as we go through here, just keeping an open mind and open heart as we have some of this conversation around equity, being respectful of one another, and then just a commitment to further learning. And so I want to start us with a question. And so for those of you that ever sat through presentation with me, I'm not a big fan of sit and get. I very much want interaction throughout. And so I'm going to start with a Mentimeter poll, and I'll put the direct link in the chat for you all as well. But you can also, if you're like me and you have your phone handy, you can scan that QR code and answer it and log on that way. You can also go to menti.com and put in the code, and I just put the link in the chat as well. And so I want us to start looking at this through a broader lens and thinking about grading holistically. We've all been through school, we've been educators, some of us have been parents with kids that have gone through school. And so I want you to think about all of those different experiences and what are some of the grading practices and philosophies you've seen different teachers use, you've used, your students or your own children's teachers use. I want you to think about all of those different practices that you've seen. Some good, some bad. Just what are some of those various grading practices that we've seen used? I'm going to leave that screen up for just one more moment before I switch over. Right. Let's make that a little easier so you can see what your colleagues are saying. So common grading practices, policies you've seen in schools or have experienced either as a student or as parents of students in a system. Awesome. Lots and lots of different answers. Awesome. And so just a word cloud. So as a word is submitted more than once, you'll see it get larger within the context of some of those other submissions. And so you'll see things like mastery, zeros, subjective, extra credit. Participation is a big one, the 10-point scale. Mastery, it makes my heart happy that mastery is as big as it is. Things like portfolio, homework and participation, bonus points, grading of homework or classwork, letter grades, retakes, grading for completion, a 7-point scale. Absolutely, we've seen that scale change and transition. Some things rigid, unequitable, no zero policies, biases, low-level quizzes, things like including work habits and behaviors. And so there are a plethora of grading practices out there, and they vary from teacher to teacher, from school to school. And even when we think in a larger context, from countries to countries, the philosophies around grading and the way that students should be graded is quite different. And so we're going to hold on to that, and we're going to come back to some of those ideals in just a minute. And so when we think about our conversation today, when we walk away from this, I want us to be able to explain and articulate to some of our teachers the why behind some of our common practices within standards-based grading, and how some of those practices and philosophies are connected to equity. If you are not familiar, our district does have an equity policy. I always try to reference it when I do any type of grading PD. So some of you that have been in some of those PDs are probably familiar with this, but I want to take a second and just pause and let you read that. So I've highlighted some of the words that really speak to me. This idea of institutional barriers within schools, and that students really need to benefit from all aspects of that learning environment. As you read that definition, are there any words that speak to you? And if you want to share those, you can add those to the chat. Anything that kind of stands out to you as you read that definition. Like I said, you can add those to the chat. Absolutely, it's a commitment, right? It's not going to happen overnight. Absolutely, Samantha. Same, Tiffany, you're right. It's not a once and done. It's not one conversation that's going to fix everything. Absolutely. I like this definition a lot because I feel like it is very encompassing of all of the different groups of students and labels we like to put on people. But it speaks to this idea that we know that in public education, there are some things that are wrong, and we need to make a commitment to fix those. And some of those things that are wrong have been wrong for a long time. And like a lot of you have said, it's not something that is going to be fixed overnight. It takes ongoing conversation and continuous work. It's truly a commitment. When we think through a lens of grading, I always reference the work of Joe Feldman. And when we look at how we define equitable grading practices, he kind of outlines 3 pillars. And so one of those is accuracy. We want our grades to be accurate, and for them to be equitable, they need to be an accurate representation of a student's learning. We also want our grades to be bias resistant. We come to this field with all kinds of different life experiences. And so when we grade students, we don't want any of our biases to affect the way in which we grade students, whether we're aware of those biases or not. And then I think this one's key, and we don't talk about it enough. is that we want grades that truly motivate students. A lot of times grades don't motivate, and there's a lot of research out there about motivation and what truly motivates people and individuals to do things. But we want our grades to foster this idea of a growth mindset and to motivate students to continue to learn and engage. And so I want us to think about some of those practices that we brainstormed in our Mentimeter. And I want us to think, are all of those practices that we put in that Mentimeter equitable? And so I pulled out some of the ones that I knew would probably bubble to the surface. And so I want us to look at those. And so that some of these you've put already, and they were part of our word cloud. But when we think through a lens of equity and we think about mathematically accurate, bias resistant, and motivating, which one of these practices don't fit that bill? So which of these practices are inequitable for our students? And if you need that QR code, and I can put the link back in the chat as well. So which ones of those, and some of you are putting it in the chat as well, things like the 100-point scale or homework. So when we think about those grading practices, which ones perhaps are not as equitable? I'll give you a second to respond. Group work, zero cheating, statistical points for late work, 100-point scale. Awesome. So there's a quote I love to use, and I use it quite often. So if you've sat through any of the PD that I've done in the past, it's one that I use a lot. But in his book about grading for equity, Joe Feldman uses the quote, and he says, "No classroom can be truly equitable until we address this inequitable foundation of our schools." And he's talking about our grading system. And so when we think through the lens of a lot of these different practices that are used by teachers all across the district, right? And some of them we acknowledge fully are not equitable for our students, then I want us to think about which of the following statements apply to standards-based grading, especially as we think through the lens of what's equitable and what's not. So when we think about the practices, our philosophies, and things that we do in standards-based grading, which of these apply to SBG? And if you need that link again. All right, so when we think about traditional grading and what some of our teachers do in 3-5 versus what our K-2 teachers do in the realm of standards-based grading, there are some big differences there. And some of you have already hit that. You hit the nail on the head, right? Something that's similar between K-2 and 3-5 is now we all use Power Teacher Pro, and we have for the last several years. That was quite a transition for our K-2 teachers at first, but most of them are getting the hang of that. The use of a 4-point scale as opposed to a 100-point scale is something that differentiates traditional grading and standards-based grading. The averaging, which is something that a lot of our teachers really struggle with. Why do we not average grades? So that's a big part of standards-based grading. We rely heavily on the use of rubrics, absolutely. When we look at the gradebook, it's set up differently as well. 3, 5, and how their gradebook categories are set up are very different than K-2. And then the crux of all of this is that standards-based grading really hinges on this idea of progression towards mastery. And if that takes multiple attempts to reach that level of mastery, then that's what we're going to do. We want students to learn. It's not a gotcha about points. It's very much about communicating student mastery at a specific point in time. And so a lot of those pieces are tied to these 3 pillars. And so when we look at the idea of averaging or the use of a different scale, a lot of those things are tied to these 3 pillars. And so we're going to touch on a few of those as we go through. And so one of the big ones, one of the big differences when we look at standards-based versus traditional is that grade scale. And historically, not just in Winston-Salem, not just in North Carolina, but across the country as a whole, those primary grades or K-2, our early grades, have traditionally had a different grading system than our upper grades, which I find very interesting. I've been reading some of the history around some of that. And so when we look here and we look at that grading scale, there's a lot of research around how the 100-point scale can be inaccurate. And so even dating back to the 1900s, back to like 1913, Starch and Elliott, these 2 researchers, they did this big study where they looked at the use of a 100-point scale, and they took a piece of writing and gave it to over 140 English teachers and said, hey, grade this. When they did that, they got over 30 different scores ranging from 64% to 98%. And so people came back at them and said, oh, well, that's English and that's very subjective. So they did the same thing with geometry. And what they found was there was an even greater variance in the grades that they got back on that geometry piece of work, anywhere from a 28% to 95%. And they fully acknowledged that teachers definitely have different grading practices, and that accounts for some of the difference. But what they found was that 100-point scale was also very much at fault. And so with over 100 or 101 degrees of separation or graduations, it becomes very difficult for teachers to articulate the difference between an 86, an 87, an 88, and an 89, right? We're trying to be very accurate, but in actuality, when we have that many degrees of separation, it becomes hard to really articulate student learning. And so it's one of the big flaws when we think about standards-based grading. In looking at their research, they found that a grading system that had no more than 9 graduations, anywhere between 4 and 9, tended to be a more accurate representation of student learning and less subjective and more consistent across the board. But when we look at that 100-point scale, it's also skewed towards failure. I have 10 points to make an A. I have 59 points to make an F. And so there's this skewing effect. Whereas when we look at standards-based grading, they're equally weighted. There is no skewing towards failure. They're equally weighted. And so our K-2 scale is dictated by board policy. It's AR 5124. This scale hasn't changed with the introduction of standards-based grading, but I am glad that we have a 4-point scale because, like I said, research shows that 100-point scale can be a little bit inequitable when we look at it. One of the big pieces that teachers struggle with is this idea of averaging. and why in standards-based grading, we don't average. And so when we think about standards-based grading, we don't average to get an overall subject grade. And teachers, that's not where they get stuck typically. But what we also don't average is when multiple points of data are used, we don't average those data points together. We take the most recent. And so we're going to talk through those pieces a little bit. When we look at an overall subject grade, and we think about those three pillars, accuracy, bias resistant, and motivation, when we look at having an overall grade, does that really articulate where my students' strengths and weaknesses lie? Is it a true representation of their progression of mastery? And so in standards-based grading, you all know this, we don't have those overall grades. We break it out into each individual standard, and each individual standard receives its own score. The bigger piece with this is the fact that we don't average the scores once they're put in. And when we look at that, I'll pause. Can anyone guess which pillar, and it may be more than one, when we think about not averaging multiple points of data, which pillar of equitable grades that aligns to? Is that accuracy, bias resistant, or motivation, or maybe more than one? And I'll let you put that in the chat. And I see that some of you have put in questions, and in just a moment, I will try to address some of those. So some people are saying motivation, accuracy. Some people are saying all motivation. Okay. When we think of the idea of averaging grades, right? A lot of times in our classrooms, we try to foster a growth mindset, a culture of not yet. If I don't have it today, then I can retry and relearn tomorrow. And we'll see teachers put up different posters all around their classroom. Give me a thumbs up if you have ever seen a poster similar to this one. Fail is your first attempt in learning. Anybody seen that in a classroom before? I see some people giving thumbs ups, yeah. Or you'll see posters like this, which I'm pretty sure I had one of these in my classroom. There's nothing inherently wrong about any of these posters, but it talks about in this classroom, mistakes are expected, respected, inspected, and corrected. The idea that mistakes are a natural part of the learning process. All too often what we see is we'll see these up in the classroom, but then as students are in the process of learning, we penalize them for those mistakes. And so that's why when we think about the way our grade book is set up, we only use one category, and that's assessments of learning, because we don't want to penalize students as they're going through that learning process. But also we look at that when we take the most recent, and we want that to foster that growth mindset, that just because you don't have it today doesn't mean you're not going to have it tomorrow. And when you hit that mark, that's what we want your grade book to reflect. I love this quote. We also want our grading to support a growth mindset so students understand grades as a temporary description of a student's level of mastery in a subject, not something that is a static definition of who that student is. I love that. And so I've used some of you that have, you've already had your BOI refresher with your early learning partners. This slide may look familiar. But when we think about student work, I want us to step out of the realm of ELA and math, science, social studies, and imagine we're art teachers. A student does some work and they submit this, and it's a level 1. They do some work, get some feedback, they submit their second sample, and it's a level 2. They put in some more work, small group instruction, one-on-one, whatever the case may be. And by the time they finish, they end up with that product at the end. If you average those scores across the board, that student would not be a level 3. On the report card, they would have a level 2. And so if you think about the amount of work and the learning that had to take place for that student to get there, over time, they learn that, and it can be demotivating for students when they don't see that their progress towards mastery is what's really communicated. And so that's one of the reasons why we don't average those scores across. We take the most recent. With the caveat that I know that it's not always this linear progression, right? Sometimes it's this back and forth, up and down. And so that's why teachers do have final judgment call when it comes to the time for report cards to be printed and given to parents. Teachers have the right to overwrite that. And even in the grade book, there'll be an indicator there, this little orange circle, when the data is sporadic and teachers need to look at it. It's called the professional judgment indicator. And it's there in the grade book for teachers to look at as you go through. One of the other big pieces that I always want to touch on is the importance of rubrics. So when we think about those 3 pillars, I said 3 and held up 4 fingers. When we think about those 3 pillars of equitable grading, and we think about our use of rubrics, which of those pillars, and you can throw this in the chat, which of these pillars do you feel like that would align to, the use of rubrics? Is it accuracy, bias resistant, motivation? Is it a combination? Is it all 3? All right, so a lot of people are saying all. So when we look at our use of rubrics, there's a couple things. We have always had a 1 to 4 scale in K2. I say always. Prior to the adoption of standards-based grading, we used that 1, 2, 3, 4 scale. We use the descriptors that are currently in use. They've been a part of board policy for a really long time. But across the district, what we saw was a level 3 at one school was not the same as a level 3 at another school. That our expectations changed, even though the definition of what a 3 should be should have been the same. The actual implementation of what that was for our K2 students could look very different from school to school because different teachers interpreted it different ways. And so when we think about it through that lens, we definitely think of those rubrics as helping with the accuracy, right? It helps to take some of that subjectivity away and create this standard across the district, that I'm no longer judging Ashley against Stacy. I'm judging Ashley against the standard, which has a rubric for what needs to be demonstrated at each level. Even more important when I think through that, not only helping with subjectivity, what is this idea of, well, I'll pause. Some of you have seen this. I've used this in multiple PDs, but it's very powerful. And so I use it in a lot of different conversations with teachers and leaders. So if you know the answer, great, you can share it. This is a piece of 2nd grade work. And when you look at those 2 samples, I'll be quiet, I promise. What are some of the big differences that you see in those 2 samples of work? If you want to, you can throw it in the chat. When you look at those 2 samples of 2nd grade work, what are the big differences? Yeah, so some of you have already stated it, right? These 2 pieces of work are identical. The only thing that are different are the names that are used. Handwriting's the same, misspellings, punctuations, all that's the same, minus the names. The sample on the left uses names that are from a list that are used to indicate a student who is white. The names on the right are used to indicate a student of color. And when these pieces of work were given to a group of teachers to grade, overwhelmingly, the student sample on the right was graded lower, when the only thing that's different are the names. And so it showed or indicated a racial bias within this study. The researchers then replicated this, but gave teachers a rubric by which to grade. And when they gave teachers that rubric, what they saw was that racial bias that showed up in the first round almost completely mitigated that racial bias. Not quite, but it greatly reduced the racial bias that showed up in that grading, because teachers had a criteria by which to grade. And so those rubrics that we use in the district are really important when it comes to grading our students. I will be fully transparent and honest. I've sat, and not even thinking through like a racial bias, but I've sat and I've graded student samples of work, and I've let some of my prior knowledge of that student influence the way in which I grade, which could be a bias for or against that student. I sat there and I said, Rebecca is capable of better work. Like this is, and instead of comparing her to what that standard says, I've compared her to some preconceived notion of what she should or should not be doing. And so those rubrics help guide us in the implementation of standards-based grading. They create a district standard so that a level 1, 2, 3, 4 is consistent throughout the district, but it also can help mitigate some of that bias that may happen or may present itself in our grading. So when we think about those different pieces, I love this quote. I nerd out when it comes to Susan Brookhart. I love her. Her quote about standards-based grading, I love. Standards-based grading is based on the principle that grades are not about what students earn. It's not about an accumulation of points or 10 points off for this or 5 extra points for this. Standards-based grading is a system that should truly be about what students learn. It's about that progression towards mastery, multiple attempts at mastery, reteaching, relearning, and articulating that mastery to students, parents, and teachers. And so just to kind of wrap us up, as we've sat through some of our BOI refreshers, there have been a couple questions that have come up that I'll just address with the whole group because they may be questions that your teachers have. One of those is a big question about how often teachers should enter grades. I get asked by teachers, ELPs get asked a lot, principals and leadership across will ask that question. And so we do have some board policy to help guide that. We typically recommend making sure you update grades at least once a week. We try to tell teachers, pick a day, whether that's Wednesday, Thursday, whatever day, and make sure that you go in and update grades at least at least once a week. And when we look, AR 5124, it's that first section about communication, and I've linked the AR policy there for you, that teachers shall have 1 week to assess and post student grades unless otherwise communicated. And when you look at that, it is not differentiating between K2, 3, 5, that is all teachers. So even your 3, 5 teachers, that would apply to. And so that's why we try to recommend, but also so that parents can go in and see that. And also there's some really great data that is generated in there when you're thinking about small groups and doing your standard analysis for your data-driven instruction. That's one question that's come up a lot this year. One of the other big questions that's come up a lot is why aren't all of the standards that appear on the UPO reported via the report card? Big question. Gotten it from several teachers. And the short answer is that when we think about standards-based grading, it's all around this communication of mastery, right? And we understand that some standards are harder for students than others, right? We know that. The rigor level, whether it's an abstract or concrete idea, developmental appropriateness, all of the things that play into student learning. And so for some of our students, yes, we're exposing them to those standards and we're teaching them Q1, but realistically, there's not an expectation that in Q1 they would have had the opportunity to become proficient. And so that's why a lot of those standards may not be addressed or reported via the report card. They're still taught. Teachers are still looking at data so that they can facilitate small groups. But that question has come up a lot. Our content experts are great. They are the ones that look at those standards and make those quarterly planning documents. But they've done a fantastic job in trying to articulate the why behind some of that as well. And then one of the other big questions as we've come up or talked through with teachers at the beginning of the year is how many assignments should I have for each? And our guidance hasn't changed on this. It is a school level decision. Some schools say 2, some say 3, some say more than that. We always, from the beginning, we've suggested at least 2 so that you can see a consistent pattern, right? So that either I know I have 2 2s or 2 3s, whatever the case may be, I have multiple points of data for that particular standard. And so that's one that has come up a lot at the beginning of the year as well. So as we've talked to teachers and gone out to schools, those are some of the ones that have kind of bubbled to the surface. I'm going to pause there. I know there are probably multiple questions. Some of them are very specific from the chat, and so I will take those and reach back out. But does anybody have any other big pressing questions? I want to be respectful of y'all's time. And so I know we're getting close to the end of that.